At 9:43 in the morning on March 22, 1944, Staff Sergeant Vincent Calabrese stood in the waist gun position of a B-24 Liberator at 22,000 feet over Brunswick, Germany, watching his right wing disintegrate. The aircraft was called Lucky Strike, serial number 42-73189. Calabrese had flown 19 missions on her. This was supposed to be number 20. The mission briefing that morning had been routine. 240 B-24 seconds from the 2nd Air Division would hit the Wagam aircraft factory outside Brunswick. Expected flak was heavy. Expected fighter opposition was moderate. Expected losses were 12 to 15 aircraft. Acceptable casualties for a strategic target. Lieutenant Michael Donovan was the pilot. 24 years old, Philadelphia. Previously, a bus driver. He'd been flying B-24 seconds for 7 months. Had 14 missions under his belt before today. His co-pilot was 2nd Lieutenant James Parker, 22, Montana ranch kid, who'd never seen a city with more than 5,000 people until he joined the Army Air Force. The bombardier was 1st Lieutenant Carl Zimmerman. Navigator was 1st Lieutenant Thomas Chen. Flight engineer was Technical Sergeant Robert Hayes. Radio operator was Staff Sergeant Daniel Murphy. And the gunners were Sergeants Calabrese, William Rodriguez, Frank Mitchell, and Joseph Kowalski. 10 men, 1 airplane, and about 7 minutes before everything went wrong. The formation reached the initial point at 0936. The bomb bay doors opened. Zimmerman started his run. The Norden bomb site was tracking perfectly. The target was clear, no clouds. Perfect visibility, perfect conditions for accurate bombing. Also perfect conditions for accurate flak. The German 88mm anti-aircraft batteries opened up at 0938. The sky filled with black puffs of exploding shells. The formation flew straight through it. You couldn't evade during the bomb run. The bombardier needed a steady platform. Any deviation meant missing the target. So they flew straight and level while the Germans tried to blow them out of the sky. Calabrese had been through this 18 times before. He knew the drill. The airplane shook from near misses. Shrapnel rattled against the fuselage like hail on a tin roof. You couldn't do anything but wait and hope the next shell wasn't the one with your name on it. The smell inside the aircraft was a mixture of aviation fuel, gun oil, sweat, and fear. The temperature at altitude was 40 degrees below zero. Calabrese wore heavy fleece-lined gear, but the cold still seeped through. His breath came out in white clouds. His fingers were numb even inside his gloves. Zimmerman released the bombs at 0941. 5,000 pounds of high explosive dropped away. The aircraft jumped upward as the weight left. Donovan started his turn off the target. The bomb bay doors closed. Now they just had to get home. 2 hours back to England. Simple. Except the Germans weren't finished. The flak shell hit Lucky Strike's number 3 engine at 0943. Number 3 was the inboard engine on the right wing. The shell was an 88mm high explosive round with a proximity fuse. It detonated 6 feet from the engine cowling. The explosion sent hundreds of steel fragments through the engine and into the wing structure behind it. Number 3 engine stopped instantly. The propeller windmilled for a few seconds, then froze. Black smoke poured from the cowling. Donovan hit the fire suppression system. CO2 flooded the engine compartment. The smoke turned from black to white, then stopped. The fire was out, but the engine was dead. Flying a B-24 on 3 engines was difficult but manageable. Thousands of aircraft had made it home on 3 engines. Some had made it on 2. The procedures were clear. Feather the dead prop. Increase power on the remaining engines. Maintain altitude and formation if possible. If not possible, drop out of formation and head home alone. Hayes was already working the problem. He feathered number 3's propeller, twisted the blades parallel to the airflow to reduce drag. Called out to Donovan that they needed more power from engines 1, 2, and 4. Donovan pushed the throttles forward. The 3 working engines roared louder. The aircraft shuddered but maintained altitude. They were going to make it. Then the wings started coming apart. The flak shell that killed number 3 engine had done more than destroy the power plant. The fragments had severed 3 of the main wing spars between the fuselage and the engine. The B-24's wing was built like a bridge, with internal spars running spanwise to carry the loads. Each spar was a steel beam, massive and strong. But steel can only take so much damage before it fails. With No. 3 engine dead, the aerodynamic loads on the wing redistributed. The wing was designed to handle those loads with all 4 engines operating. With one engine out, the loads shifted. With 3 spars cut through, the remaining structure had to carry loads it wasn't designed for. The wing skin between the fuselage and No. 3 engine started to buckle. Calabrese saw it first. He was looking out the waist gun window when he noticed the wing surface rippling, not vibrating, rippling, like water in a pond when you drop a stone. Metal shouldn't move like that. He called it out on the intercom. Right wing's doing something weird. Looks like the skin's buckling. Hayes moved to the waist position to look. What he saw made his stomach drop. The wing wasn't just buckling, it was deforming. The skin between 2 ribs had developed a visible wave. As he watched, the wave grew larger. The rivet heads along the wing panel were starting to pop. He could see them shearing off one by one. Pop, pop, pop. Like someone walking down the wing with a hammer. Hayes called Donovan. Pilot from engineer. We've got structural failure developing on the right wing. Recommend we reduce airspeed immediately. Donovan was already feeling it in the controls. The aircraft wanted to roll right. He had to hold left aileron pressure constantly to keep the wings level, and the pressure was increasing. The airplane was trying to roll over. He reduced throttle on engines 2 and 4. The aircraft slowed from 170 miles per hour to 140. The buffeting decreased slightly, but the wing was still deforming. Parker called out, "We need to lighten the load. Start throwing stuff out." The crew started jettisoning equipment, ammunition cans, toolboxes. Anything that wasn't bolted down went out the waist gun windows. 700 pounds of equipment tumbled toward Germany. The aircraft felt marginally lighter, but it wasn't enough. The wing was still failing. At 09:51, 8 minutes after the flak hit, the outer 15 feet of Lucky Strike's right wing folded upward, 30 degrees, and froze in that position. The metal had fatigued to the point where it could no longer support the aerodynamic loads. The wing structure between No. 3 and No. 4 engines simply bent upward and stayed there. No. 4 engine was now pointing 15 degrees above the horizon. Its thrust was pushing the airplane's nose down instead of forward. The aircraft rolled hard right. Donovan shoved the control wheel left as far as it would go. Added full left rudder. The roll stopped with the right wing 45 degrees down. They were in a banking turn they couldn't stop. The aircraft started to spiral. Altitude began dropping. 22,000 feet, 21,000, 20,000. Donovan was fighting the controls with both hands. His arms were shaking from the effort. Parker had his hands on the wheel too, pulling with everything he had. Between them, they barely had enough strength to keep the aircraft from rolling inverted. Hayes called out, "We're losing hydraulic pressure. Left main line is dropping." The hydraulic system powered the control surfaces. Without hydraulic pressure, the control surfaces became nearly impossible to move. The aircraft would become uncontrollable. They'd have maybe 2 minutes before they had to bail out. Parker started to reach for the bailout bell. Then something impossible happened. No. 3 engine started running again. The propeller began to turn, slowly at first, then faster. The blades were still feathered, parallel to the airflow, but the engine was producing power. Hayes stared at the instrument panel in disbelief. No. 3 tachometer showed the engine spinning at 800 RPM. That was impossible. The engine was dead. The fire suppression system had flooded it with CO2. The ignition was off. The fuel valves were closed. There was no possible way for it to be running. But it was running, and it was producing thrust. Not much, maybe 15% of normal power. But 15% was enough to help counteract the aerodynamic imbalance from the bent wing. Donovan felt it immediately. The control pressure decreased. The aircraft stopped rolling. The spiral leveled off at 18,000 feet. They were flying again, sort of. Hayes tried to make sense of what was happening. No. 3 engine's fuel valves were closed. He'd closed them himself when he feathered the prop. But the engine was running, which meant it was getting fuel from somewhere. Then he realized the flak damage must have ruptured the fuel lines. Fuel was leaking directly into the engine compartment. The engine was running on leaking fuel, bypassing all the normal fuel control systems. It was essentially running wild. He couldn't control it, couldn't adjust the power, couldn't shut it down. The engine was running itself. And that should have been catastrophic. An uncontrolled engine running on leaking fuel was a massive fire hazard. The engine compartment was full of fuel vapor. One spark and the wing would explode. But somehow it wasn't exploding. Somehow the engine was burning the leaking fuel cleanly enough to avoid igniting the vapors in the compartment. It was the mechanical equivalent of a miracle. An engine that was dead, that should have stayed dead, that had no business running, was now keeping them alive. Donovan assessed the situation. They were at 18,000 feet, flying at 130 miles per hour. They'd lost 3,000 feet and 40 miles per hour of airspeed. The right wing was bent upward at a 30-degree angle. Number 3 engine was running on leaking fuel with no pilot control. They'd dropped out of formation. They were alone over Germany with 600 miles to go before reaching England. And German fighters were in the area. The logical decision was to bail out, order the crew to jump. Everyone would have a chance at survival as POWs. The aircraft was clearly doomed. Trying to fly it back to England was suicide. But Donovan looked at the controls. The aircraft was flying, barely, but flying. And number 3 engine was still running, still producing thrust. As long as it kept running, they had a chance. A slim chance. But a chance. He made the decision. We're taking her home. Everyone stay at your stations. The crew didn't argue. They'd been through too much together to question Donovan now. If he said they were flying home, they were flying home, even if it was impossible. The next 2 hours were the longest of their lives. Donovan and Parker flew the aircraft together, both hands on the controls constantly. The bent wing created massive drag. The aircraft wanted to roll right continuously. They had to maintain constant left control pressure just to keep the wings level. Their arms burned with fatigue, their hands cramped, but they couldn't let go. If either of them released pressure for even a second, the aircraft would roll over. Hayes monitored number 3 engine like a nervous parent watching a sick child. The tachometer fluctuated between 700 and 900 RPM. The cylinder head temperature was running hot, 280 degrees Celsius. Normal was 220. The engine was cooking itself, but it was still running. The fuel pressure gauge for number 3 showed 0 because the fuel valves were closed, but fuel was clearly getting to the engine through the ruptured lines. Hayes estimated they were losing 50 gallons per hour through the leak. At that rate, they'd run out of fuel before reaching England. But there was nothing he could do about it. The hydraulic pressure continued dropping. Left main line was down to 800 psi. Normal was 1500. They were losing fluid somewhere in the system. The flak damage had probably severed a hydraulic line. Without hydraulic pressure, the control surfaces would freeze. Hayes tried to isolate the leak, but the damage was too extensive. All he could do was monitor the pressure and pray it lasted long enough. At 10:37, German fighters appeared. 2 Focke-Wulf 190s, approaching from 6 o'clock high. Rodriguez called them out from the tail gun position. "Fighters! 6 o'clock! 2 bandits!" Donovan's blood went cold. They couldn't maneuver, couldn't dive, couldn't climb, couldn't even turn effectively. They were a sitting duck. The only thing keeping them airborne was prayer and a dead engine that wouldn't die. If the fighters attacked, they were finished. The Focke-Wulfs circled once, looking them over. Calabrese watched them through his gun sight. He could see the German pilots in their cockpits, could see them gesturing to each other. They knew Lucky Strike was crippled. Easy kill. Then something unexpected happened. The German fighters waggled their wings and flew away. Didn't attack, just left. Calabrese couldn't believe it. Rodriguez called out, "They're leaving. Fighters breaking off." No one understood why. Maybe the German pilots thought Lucky Strike was already going down. Maybe they were low on fuel. Maybe they just didn't want to waste ammunition on an aircraft that was clearly doomed. Whatever the reason, they left. and Lucky Strike flew on. At 11:15, they crossed the Dutch coast. 250 miles to go. Hayes checked the fuel gauges. They were burning fuel at an unsustainable rate. The leak from No. 3 engine was draining the tanks faster than he'd calculated. At current consumption, they'd run dry over the North Sea. 30 miles from England. So close, but not close enough. He called Donovan. "Pilot from engineer, fuel situation is critical. We're going to flame out before we reach England." Donovan thought for a moment, then keyed the radio. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Lucky Strike, 42-73189. We're a crippled B-24 over the North Sea. Fuel critical. Structural damage. Request emergency clearance to nearest airfield." The response came back immediately. "Lucky Strike, this is RAF Halesworth. We copy your mayday. You're cleared for straight-in approach to runway 2-4. Emergency crews standing by." Halesworth was a fighter base on the coast. Short runway. Barely long enough for a B-24. But it was the closest field, and they didn't have enough fuel to be picky. Donovan altered course. Halesworth was 40 miles ahead, 10 minutes. They just needed to stay in the air for 10 more minutes. At 11:22, No. 1 engine quit. Fuel starvation. The tank was empty. Hayes feathered the prop. Now they were down to 2 working engines. No. 2 on the left wing and No. 4 on the bent right wing, plus No. 3 running wild on leaking fuel. 2.5 engines. Altitude was dropping. 16,000 feet. 15,000. 14,000. Parker was shaking from the physical effort of holding the controls. His arms were beyond tired, beyond pain, operating on nothing but will and adrenaline. Donovan wasn't any better. His vision was starting to tunnel from the strain. But they couldn't give up. Not now. Not this close. At 11:28, they saw the English coast. The white cliffs were the most beautiful thing any of them had ever seen. Mitchell started crying. Couldn't help it. They'd made it. Somehow, impossibly, they'd made it across the North Sea. Calabrese was laughing. The relief was overwhelming. But they weren't down yet. Halesworth appeared ahead. The runway looked impossibly small, a narrow strip of concrete barely visible against the green fields. Donovan set up for the approach. No time for a pattern. Straight in. The aircraft was at 4,000 feet, descending. 3,000. The bent wing created so much drag that they were falling faster than normal. 2,500 feet, 2,000. At 1,000 feet, No. 4 engine quit. Fuel starvation. The right wing tanks were empty. Hayes tried to feather the prop, but the hydraulic pressure was too low. The propeller windmilled, creating massive drag. The aircraft yawed hard right. Donovan stomped left rudder. Nothing happened. The rudder control cable had finally failed. They'd lost rudder authority completely. They were 500 feet above the ground, lined up with the runway, and the aircraft was yawing right. In 10 seconds, they'd be pointed 30 degrees off the runway heading. They'd miss the runway completely, crash into the countryside. Parker looked at Donovan. Donovan looked back. Neither said anything. There was nothing to say. They'd come 600 miles on a crippled aircraft with a dead engine that wouldn't die, and they were going to crash half a mile from the runway. Then No. 3 engine surged. The wild engine that had been running on leaking fuel suddenly increased power. RPM jumped from 800 to 1,200. The thrust from No. 3 pushed the nose left, corrected the yaw. The aircraft straightened out, lined up with the runway. Donovan had no idea why it happened, no idea what made the engine surge at exactly the right moment. But he didn't question it. He just wrote it down. Lucky Strike hit the runway at 110 miles per hour with a bone-jarring impact that collapsed the right main landing gear. The aircraft slewed right. The bent wing dipped. The wingtip hit the runway and dug in. The aircraft spun 90 degrees, slid sideways for 200 feet. Metal screamed. Sparks flew. The right wing started to tear away from the fuselage. Then everything stopped. Lucky Strike came to rest on the right side of the runway, listing 30 degrees right. The bent wing crumpled, fuel leaking onto the concrete, but intact. The crew was alive. Donovan shut down the engines. No. 2 and No. 3 stopped. The silence was deafening after 4 hours of engine noise. Emergency crews swarmed the aircraft. Fire trucks, ambulances. Ground crew pulled the waist gun hatches open, helped the crew out. Calabrese climbed out and kissed the ground. Mitchell collapsed on the grass, too exhausted to stand. Hayes walked around the aircraft in a daze, staring at the damage. The right wing was destroyed. The outer 15 feet were bent upward like a bird in flight. Number 3 engine was a blackened wreck held together by luck and stubbornness. The wing skin was torn in dozens of places. Rivets were missing everywhere. The fuselage had over 200 holes from flak fragments. The right main landing gear was twisted metal. By every engineering standard, Lucky Strike should have fallen apart over Germany. But she hadn't. She'd held together long enough to bring her crew home. The RAF maintenance officer who examined the wreckage said it was the worst structural damage he'd ever seen on an aircraft that made it back. He couldn't explain how the wing had stayed attached. Couldn't explain how number 3 engine had run with no fuel supply and no ignition control. Couldn't explain how the hydraulic system had lasted long enough for them to land. The aircraft had violated every principle of engineering and aerodynamics. It should have been impossible. But 10 men standing on the grass were proof it had happened. The official accident report concluded that Lucky Strike was damaged beyond repair and would be scrapped. But before that happened, Lockheed sent an engineering team to examine the aircraft. They wanted to understand how it had survived. What they found changed how B-24 wings were built. The flak shell had severed 3 main spars, but it had missed the 4th spar by inches. That one remaining spar had carried the entire wing load for 2 hours. The spar was bent, cracked, on the verge of complete failure, but it had held. The Lockheed engineers calculated that the spar had been loaded to 180% of its design limit. It should have snapped, but the steel alloy used in that particular production run was slightly stronger than specification. Random variation in the metallurgy. The extra strength was just enough to keep the spar from breaking. As for number 3 engine, the engineers found that the flak damage had ruptured the fuel line, but had also damaged the fuel shutoff valve, preventing it from fully closing. Fuel leaked past the damaged valve directly into the cylinders. The engine basically ran on vapor injection, burning fuel that was seeping into the combustion chambers. It was wildly inefficient, potentially catastrophic, but it worked. The engine had run for 2 hours with no pilot control, no proper fuel supply, and internal damage that should have destroyed it. The engineers couldn't reproduce the condition in testing. They tried. Built a damaged engine simulation, tried to make it run like number 3 had. It wouldn't work. The real engine had done something the engineers couldn't replicate. Donovan and his crew were debriefed for 6 hours. Intelligence wanted every detail, every decision, every moment of the flight. The debriefers kept asking Donovan why he hadn't ordered the crew to bail out. Standard procedure for catastrophic structural failure was immediate bailout. Staying with the aircraft was considered suicide. Donovan said he couldn't explain his decision. The aircraft was flying. As long as it was flying, he felt they had a chance. That was all. The intelligence officers noted that Donovan's decision violated standard procedures. Then they noted that his decision had saved 10 lives. No formal recommendation was made either way. Donovan flew 16 more missions, completed his tour, went home to Philadelphia in September 1944. He never flew again. Couldn't bring himself to get in an airplane after the war. Too many memories. He worked as a bus driver until retirement in 1982, married, had 3 kids, normal life. But every March 22nd, he thought about Lucky Strike. Thought about the bent wing and the dead engine that wouldn't die. Thought about how close they'd come to not making it. Parker stayed in the Air Force, became a pilot instructor, taught young pilots how to fly multi-engine bombers. He told them about Lucky Strike in every class. Told them that aircraft can survive damage beyond imagination if you keep flying them. Told them never to give up on an airplane that's still in the air. Some of his students thought he was exaggerating. He showed them photographs of Lucky Strike on the runway at Halesworth. The bent wing, the destroyed engine, the shredded fuselage. The students stopped questioning his stories. Hayes became an aeronautical engineer after the war, worked for Boeing for 33 years, designed structural systems for the B-52 and 707. He never forgot what he'd learned about metal fatigue on that flight. Every wing spar he designed had extra safety margin built in, extra strength beyond specification, because he knew that someday, somewhere, an aircraft would need that extra strength to bring its crew home. The rest of the crew scattered after the war. Calabrese opened a restaurant in New York. Rodriguez became a teacher. Mitchell worked construction. Kowalski ran a hardware store. Murphy died in 1978, Chen in 1992. They stayed in touch through Christmas cards and occasional phone calls. Every March 22nd, those who were still alive called each other. Didn't need to say much, just needed to hear each other's voices, to remember. Lucky Strike was scrapped in April 1944, cut up for parts and recycled into new aircraft. The bent wing was saved for analysis. It sat in a Lockheed warehouse for 20 years. Then it was moved to a storage facility, then to another. Eventually it was lost. No one knows where it ended up. Probably melted down decades ago. But there's a photograph in the Air Force Museum archives, black and white, taken at RAF Halesworth on March 22, 1944. Shows a B-24 with its right wing bent upward like a broken bird. 10 men standing in front of it. They're not smiling. They look exhausted, hollow-eyed, like people who've just survived something impossible. In the bottom corner, someone wrote in pen, "The aircraft that wouldn't quit, the crew that wouldn't die, Lucky Strike, March 44. That's how survival actually happens in war. Not through superior firepower or brilliant tactics, through bent metal that holds when it shouldn't, through engines that run when they can't, through pilots who refuse to give up even when giving up is the logical choice, through random metallurgy variations and ruptured fuel lines that leak at exactly the right rate, through 1,000 tiny factors that align just right to let 10 men go home instead of dying over Germany." If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.